During World War II, food in America changed in ways modern families can barely imagine. Before the war, dinner could be simple. A family could walk into a grocery store and buy meat, butter, sugar, and canned foods without thinking too much about shortages. But once wartime rationing began, everything changed. Suddenly, everyday foods became difficult to get. Sugar became precious. Butter had to be measured carefully. Meat portions shrank. Cooking oil was saved and reused. Coffee became harder to find. Grocery shopping became stressful as supplies dwindled. For poor American families, this was even harder. With ration books controlling what people could buy, millions had to become creative. And that is where one-bowl meals became lifesavers. These meals were more than just soup. They had to provide warmth and energy. One bowl had to stretch tiny amounts of meat, transform stale bread into food, and make cheap ingredients feel like enough. After factory shifts and stressful nights listening to war news, families needed something hot and filling sitting on the kitchen table. Tonight, we begin exploring the one-bowl meals that helped Americans survive. You may never look at simple soup the same way again. First, navy bean soup. This meal appeared in poor kitchens repeatedly because beans were cheap and provided essential protein during meat shortages. Mothers soaked dried beans overnight. Then those beans went into pots with onions, potatoes, and sometimes a single, precious ham bone for flavor. As the soup simmered, the beans softened and thickened the broth. Children received giant bowls with slices of bread to stretch the meal. Second, chicken rice soup. Wartime families used every part of the chicken, bones, skin, and scraps to create a rich, comforting broth. Rice mattered because it expanded while cooking. A handful of rice could turn a small amount of flavor into a meal for many. Third, tomato bread soup. This dish was born from a wartime rule. Bread could not be wasted. Even stale slices were transformed. Families tore old bread directly into simmering tomato broth. It softened and thickened the liquid, creating a meal that was surprisingly filling. Fourth, beef and barley soup. The secret wasn't the beef, it was the barley. It absorbed liquid and created a dense, satisfying texture. Fifth, corn chowder. This meal made simple ingredients feel rich. Potatoes and onions simmered slowly, often with watered-down milk to stretch the dairy. Sixth, lentil soup. Lentils provided cheap protein when meat was scarce. It became a patriotic choice encouraged by government nutrition campaigns. Finally, potato onion soup. This used the simplest ingredients: potatoes, onions, water, and salt. It was the ultimate symbol of wartime survival. During the hardest nights of World War II, a single hot bowl meant a family would not go to bed hungry. They endured. As World War II continued, millions of American families became experts at making one simple bowl of food do the job of an entire dinner. That bowl had to provide warmth, it had to provide energy, it had to stretch tiny ingredients, and sometimes it had to feed a whole family when there was almost nothing left inside the kitchen. Because wartime cooking was no longer about recipes, it became strategy. A spoonful of grease had to flavor an entire pot. One onion had to make broth taste rich. A handful of rice had to stretch meat farther. Old bread had to become soup. Leftover vegetables had to become dinner. Nothing could be wasted, and for poor families already living paycheck to paycheck, these one-bowl meals became even more important. Because one giant pot sitting on the stove meant something powerful. Everyone would eat tonight. Some of these bowls looked simple. Some looked strange. Some became famous comfort foods, and others existed purely because families had no other choice. Tonight we continue exploring the one-bowl meals that helped Americans survive World War II, and some of these forgotten bowls tell a survival story that modern families can barely imagine. 8. Split pea soup. If navy bean soup was one of the kings of wartime survival food, split pea soup was right beside it. This bowl appeared constantly during World War II because split peas solved several problems all at once. They were cheap, they lasted a long time in storage, they provided protein, and most importantly, they turned into thick filling soup with very little effort. That made them incredibly valuable during rationing years. The process usually started with dried split peas poured into giant pots with onions, carrots, potatoes, water, and sometimes leftover ham bones or tiny bacon scraps if the family got lucky. Now, just like many wartime meals, the meat was not there to feed everyone directly. It existed for flavor. That small detail says a lot about wartime cooking. Tiny amounts of expensive ingredients had to transform entire meals. As the soup simmered slowly, the peas softened and broke apart naturally, thickening the broth into creamy, heavy soup. Children often looked suspiciously at the green color. But once the bowl arrived hot with bread on the side, it became one of the most filling meals a family could eat. One fascinating detail about split pea soup involved leftovers. The soup often became even thicker the next day. Some families actually liked reheated split pea soup more because the flavor deepened overnight. Factory workers loved split pea soup because it stayed heavy in the stomach for hours after dinner. And during cold wartime winters, a steaming bowl of split pea soup felt like comfort in its purest form. Many older Americans later remembered split pea soup as one of those meals that seemed to appear over and over. Not glamorous, not exciting, but dependable. And during World War II, dependability mattered. 9. Rice and bean bowl. Few meals represented wartime survival more honestly than rice and beans. This bowl was simple, cheap, filling, and capable of feeding large families with very little money. The process usually started with beans simmering slowly inside water or broth with onions, salt, and whatever vegetables remained. Carrots, cabbage scraps, celery tops, sometimes tiny sausage slices entered the pot for flavor. Sometimes meat did not appear at all. Then rice entered bowls underneath or got mixed directly into the pot, and that changed everything because rice expanded while cooking. A small amount of beans suddenly became a much larger meal. Children often liked rice and beans because the warm, soft texture felt comforting, especially when broth or gravy covered the bowl. Parents loved it because the meal provided fullness without destroying the grocery budget. One fascinating detail about wartime rice bowls involved creativity. Different households changed the meal constantly. Many older Americans later remembered rice and beans as one of the most dependable hard times meals during wartime America. 10. Creamed peas bowl. Modern audiences may not think of this as a dinner, but for wartime families, it absolutely was. The process usually started with canned peas heating inside a simple white sauce made from flour, watered-down milk, and butter. That creamy sauce mattered because it made cheap ingredients feel richer. Then the peas got poured directly over toast, potatoes, or torn bread sitting inside bowls. Children often reacted differently. Some loved the creamy texture. Others understood something deeper. Meals like this often appeared when money was running dangerously low. One fascinating detail about wartime cream sauces involved powdered milk. Many poor households relied heavily on it. 11. Chicken dumpling bowl. Wartime versions looked very different from rich modern recipes. Most poor families could not afford large chicken portions. Instead, mothers used bones, scraps, and leftover broth. Inside the pot, onions, carrots, celery, and potatoes simmered until flavor developed. Then simple flour dumplings got dropped in, and those dumplings changed everything. Because dumplings expanded while cooking. 12. Cabbage soup. Cabbage became one of the greatest survival vegetables. It was cheap and lasted a long time. As the cabbage softened, it released sweetness into the broth while potatoes thickened the soup naturally. One fascinating detail involved neighborhood memory. Entire apartment buildings often smelled like it. 13. Tomato macaroni bowl. This dish became popular because pasta and tomatoes cost far less than meat. Many older Americans later remembered tomato macaroni as one of the few fun hard times meals. 14. Cornmeal mush bowl. Perhaps one of the strangest one-bowl survival meals was cornmeal mush. The process usually started with cornmeal boiled slowly inside water or milk until thick porridge formed. If extra mush remained, families cooled it overnight, sliced it, and fried it the next day. Nothing got wasted, and many older Americans later remembered cornmeal mush as one of the strongest symbols of wartime poverty. Not because it looked impressive, but because it quietly kept people alive, one bowl at a time. As we continue exploring the forgotten one-bowl meals that helped Americans survive World War II, the next bowls become even more fascinating. Some were created because meat had become too expensive. Some existed because families refused to waste even the smallest leftovers. And some became comfort foods, so deeply connected to wartime memories that people remembered them for the rest of their lives. Because during World War II, a bowl of food was never just food, it was warmth, it was comfort, it was survival, and sometimes, it was the only thing standing between a family and an empty stomach. Let's continue. 15. Onion gravy bread bowl. One of the simplest yet smartest one-bowl survival meals was onion gravy bread bowl. This meal existed because poor families understood a powerful truth. Onions could make almost anything taste richer. The process usually started with onions sliced thin and cooked slowly inside a skillet using tiny spoonfuls of saved grease. As onions browned, they released sweetness and created a smell that filled entire kitchens. That smell was powerful. Then flour entered the pan. Water or broth followed. And slowly a simple onion gravy formed. That gravy got poured directly over stale bread pieces sitting inside bowls. The bread soaked up the liquid and softened. 16. Potato milk soup. Another incredibly common one-bowl survival meal during WWII was potato milk soup. The process usually started with potatoes boiled until soft inside water or thin broth. Then onions entered the pot. After that, watered-down milk or powdered milk got added carefully to create creamy texture. Salt and pepper helped improve flavor. Children usually accepted potato milk soup surprisingly well because the warm, creamy texture felt comforting. Families frequently watered down dairy heavily because fresh milk had to last longer. Some used powdered milk instead. Bread almost always appeared beside the bowl because bread made everything bigger. 17. Ham bone split bean soup. Few bowls represented wartime kitchen creativity better than ham bone split bean soup. Poor families understood something modern households often forget. Bones still held enormous value. Mothers placed them into pots with onions, carrots, and dried peas. Then the soup simmered slowly for hours. As the peas softened, they thickened the broth naturally while the ham bone released smoky richness. Factory workers especially appreciated bean soups because they stayed heavy in the stomach and provided cheap protein. 18. Tomato rice bowl. This dish became popular because rice and tomatoes stretched beautifully together. Then canned tomatoes, water and rice entered the pot. As the rice cooked, it absorbed tomato broth and expanded heavily. Tomatoes helped cheap ingredients taste stronger and more flavorful without needing expensive meat or seasonings. 19. Creamed corn bowl. Corn appeared in many wartime kitchens because it was affordable, filling, and easy to stretch. The result became thick enough to serve as a one-bowl dinner. Children often enjoyed this meal more than adults. Bread almost always accompanied corn bowls. Some families tore bread directly into the soup to create thicker texture. 20. Macaroni bean bowl. One of the smartest meals combined cheap ingredients, macaroni and beans. As everything simmered, the noodles softened and absorbed broth while the beans created protein and heaviness. Many mothers intentionally cooked noodles longer because soft pasta absorbed more liquid and made bowls appear larger. 21. Bread and potato soup. Perhaps no bowl represented wartime poverty more honestly than bread and potato soup. This meal existed because poor families could not afford waste. Old bread became too valuable to throw away. As the bread soaked up liquid, it thickened the soup naturally into dense, stew-like texture. It filled stomachs extremely well. A thick bowl looked bigger than tiny separate portions of food. Mothers understood that. Even the appearance of abundance mattered. Many remembered this soup because it carried families through some of the hardest nights of the war, one hot bowl at a time.
By the middle of World War II, many American families had stopped thinking about dinner the way they once did. Before rationing, a meal might include separate dishes, meat on one plate, vegetables on another, bread on the side. Dessert if the family got lucky, but wartime changed everything. Now one bowl often had to do the work of an entire meal. That single bowl had to stretch leftovers, it had to make tiny ingredients feel bigger. It had to keep workers full after exhausting shifts, and sometimes it had to feed children when there was barely enough food left in the kitchen. That is why one-bowl meals became some of the smartest survival foods of wartime America. They were warm, they were practical, they were filling. Tonight, we continue exploring the one-bowl meals that helped Americans survive World War II, and the next bowls show just how creative kitchens became. Few one-bowl meals appeared more often than cabbage and potato bowls. This dish became famous among poor families because both ingredients were cheap. The process usually started with potatoes boiling slowly inside a large pot alongside shredded cabbage, onions, salt, pepper, and water or thin broth. As the cabbage softened, it released sweetness into the broth. The potatoes thickened the liquid naturally, creating a warm, heavy bowl. Another legendary one-bowl comfort meal was chicken noodle bowl. Modern audiences may imagine rich soup filled with thick chicken chunks, but wartime versions looked much simpler. Mothers used chicken bones, scraps, and leftover broth stretched inside a giant pot. Then came noodles. Because noodles absorbed broth while expanding, turning small amounts of chicken flavor into something much bigger. Barley became one of the greatest survival ingredients of wartime America, and that is exactly why barley vegetable bowls appeared constantly. As the barley cooked, it absorbed liquid and expanded heavily. The result became thick, chewy, and much more filling than ordinary soup. One of the simplest one-bowl survival meals was cornbread and milk bowl. During wartime poverty, it absolutely became a dinner. The process usually started with crumbled cornbread placed in bowls. Then warm milk or watered-down milk got poured over until it softened. Another powerful one-bowl meal was beef rice bowl. This dish became important because rice stretched meat beautifully. As the rice absorbed flavor, it expanded heavily and carried the beef taste throughout the bowl. Rice made that possible. Few one-bowl meals represented wartime simplicity better than onion gravy potato bowl. This dish used simple ingredients to create warmth. Children often mashed the potatoes directly into the gravy until the bowl became thick and creamy. It was an end-of-the-week meal. Perhaps one of the smartest wartime one-bowl meals was tomato bean bowl. Beans provided protein, and tomatoes provided flavor. Many older Americans remembered this as one of the classic hard times. Bowls, simple, cheap, reliable, and powerful enough to keep families alive. Cooking grease got saved in jars. Old bread never got thrown away. And grocery shopping itself had become stressful because of unpredictable store stock. For poor American households, this created a new kind of kitchen thinking. Dinner was no longer planned around cravings. It was planned around survival. Families stopped asking what they felt like eating and started asking what they could make with what was left. That question shaped millions of kitchens. The answer often came in the form of one bowl, because one bowl could stretch ingredients and combine leftovers to feel bigger than separate portions. One bowl could create warmth during stressful evenings. and one bowl could sometimes mean the difference between going to bed hungry or making it through. Tonight, we continue exploring the forgotten one-bowl meals that kept Americans alive, and these next bowls show just how creative survival cooking really became. 29. Navy Bean and Rice Bowl. One of the smartest wartime one-bowl meals combined two powerful survival ingredients, beans and rice. Together, they became one of the most dependable meals poor families could make. The process started with navy beans simmering slowly inside a giant pot, with onions, salt, pepper, and sometimes tiny scraps of ham bone that broth mattered. Even a little flavor could transform a cheap meal. Once the beans softened, rice entered the pot or was placed inside bowls underneath. Rice absorbed liquid beautifully, making a small bowl look much larger. A tiny amount of protein stretched across more people. Children liked this meal because the texture felt softer than plain bean soup. One fascinating detail involved visual fullness. A bowl piled high with rice and beans looked like a real meal, which mattered enormously during rationing. Factory workers appreciated this combination because it stayed filling for hours. It was dependable enough to carry families through hard times. 30. Chicken Broth Bread Bowl. This dish represented wartime creativity because it transformed leftovers into dinner. The process started with chicken bones simmering slowly. That broth was valuable. Broth meant flavor, warmth, and comfort. But the real magic came when stale bread got torn directly into bowls. Then hot chicken broth got poured over the bread until it softened. What began as scraps suddenly became a filling meal. Meals like this prevented waste, which became almost a moral duty. Even the simple smell of broth on the stove created powerful emotional comfort. 31. Potato Corn Chowder Bowl. Corn and potatoes became survival stars. When combined, they became one of the most comforting meals of the wartime years. The process involved boiling potatoes with onions and watered-down milk. Some mashed part of the potatoes into the broth to create creaminess without expensive dairy. Many wartime versions stayed completely meatless. Children loved the sweet corn flavor, while parents appreciated the bulk that potatoes created. 32. Split Pea and Potato Bowl. Split pea soup was already common, but adding potatoes directly into the bowl made it even heavier and more filling. Some versions became so thick they looked closer to stew than soup. Thicker bowls felt more filling, and appearance affected satisfaction during food shortages. 33. Macaroni Tomato Bean Bowl. This dish combined beans, pasta, and tomatoes, three cheap ingredients that stretched beautifully into something powerful. Mothers intentionally overcooked pasta slightly because softer noodles absorbed more liquid and physically made the bowls look much larger. 34. Onion Potato Milk Bowl. This dish used ingredients many families almost always had: potatoes, onions, and powdered milk. That was enough for survival. Many households relied on powdered milk because fresh dairy was hard to obtain. Families adapted because survival demanded it. Bread almost always accompanied the bowl. 35. Bread Dumpling Soup Bowl. Stale bread could never be wasted. It was soaked in water or milk and mixed with flour to become dumplings. Those dumplings dropped into broth became a meal that perfectly represented the wartime rule: waste nothing, stretch everything, and make it enough.
By the middle and later years of World War II, one-bowl meals had become more than just cheap dinners in American homes. They had become a survival system, because by this point, families had learned something important. A single bowl could do what an entire meal used to. It could stretch meat. It could use leftovers. It could combine vegetables, broth, starch, and protein all in one place. And perhaps most importantly, it could make a small amount of food feel like enough. That mattered enormously during wartime, because rationing was not just about shortages. It was about psychology too. Families needed to feel like dinner existed. Children needed to look at a bowl and believe there was enough. Parents needed giant steaming pots on the stove because that visual comfort mattered. Workers returning home after exhausting shifts needed something warm, heavy and filling waiting for them at the end of the day. That is exactly why one-bowl meals became some of the smartest foods of wartime America. Simple ingredients, creative cooking. Tonight, we continue exploring the forgotten one-bowl meals that kept Americans alive during World War II. The next bowls may be the most fascinating yet. One of the most comforting one-bowl meals was the creamed corn potato bowl. This dish transformed basic ingredients into something warm and filling. The process usually started with potatoes boiling slowly inside water or thin broth. Then canned creamed corn entered the pot along with onions. Others mashed part of the potatoes directly into the soup. That created a creamy texture without needing expensive butter or heavy dairy. Children often liked this bowl because the sweet corn flavor made it feel softer. Potatoes created bulk. Corn created flavor. One fascinating detail involved psychology. Warm, creamy textures created emotional comfort during stressful years. Food was not just fuel, it was emotional relief. Few meals showed wartime food stretching better than the cabbage rice bowl. The process started with shredded cabbage simmering with onions and grease. Then rice entered the mixture. As the rice absorbed broth, it expanded heavily. Together, the two ingredients created something surprisingly filling. Raw cabbage took up enormous space in the pot. That visual fullness mattered emotionally. The giant pot gave families a feeling that plenty existed. Another classic survival meal was beef broth noodle bowl. This dish stretched tiny amounts of beef flavor across giant portions. Then noodles entered the pot. Once noodles began absorbing the broth, everything changed. Tiny ingredients felt like a complete meal. Even tiny amounts of beef simmering for hours created strong kitchen aromas. That smell itself made families feel emotionally comforted. Potatoes and beans became one of the strongest survival combinations. Together, they created a meal capable of feeding entire households cheaply. As the potatoes softened, they thickened the broth naturally. The beans created protein. The potatoes created heaviness. Many families cooked giant pots because the meal reheated beautifully the next day. Nothing got wasted. Tomatoes and barley created another powerful meal. This dish became common because it combined cheap grain with strong flavor. As the barley cooked, it absorbed tomato broth and expanded heavily. That transformed simple soup into a thick, hearty bowl. Barley stayed dense and chewy much longer than pasta. That made the bowl feel heavier and more filling psychologically. Few meals represented wartime simplicity more honestly than bread and onion soup bowl. Cheap ingredients could still create comfort. Stale bread got torn directly into bowls. Hot onion broth poured over the bread until everything softened. That was dinner. Rich kitchen smells made meals feel emotionally bigger than reality. Mothers understood that instinctively. During wartime, that comfort mattered deeply. One of the most unusual meals was the rice milk bowl. Modern audiences may think of this as dessert, but for poor families, it was dinner. Poorer households often used powdered milk. Many versions contained only rice, milk, and salt. It was soft, creamy, and comforting. Mothers served comforting textures during stressful evenings because morale inside the home mattered. Nothing got wasted. These rice milk bowls were last food before payday meals. Simple, quiet, and powerful enough to carry families through one more difficult night.
By the later years of World War II, American families had become experts at something modern households rarely think about: making food last. Not just for one meal, not just for one day, but for as long as possible. Every ingredient had value. A leftover potato could become tomorrow's soup. A ham bone could flavor an entire pot. Old bread could become dumplings or broth bowls. Even vegetable scraps that might be thrown away today often became dinner. Nothing disappeared. Nothing got wasted. Because millions were already living on tight budgets before rationing, these survival skills became vital. One bowl meals were a huge part of wartime life. One bowl held everything: protein, starch, vegetables, and comfort. For exhausted factory workers, it meant one thing: there would be food tonight. 43. Ham bone barley bowl. Few meals showed wartime intelligence better than this. Poor families understood that bones were never useless. As it cooked for hours, the barley absorbed broth while the bone released smoky flavor. Taste helped families survive repetitive cheap meals. Children searched for tiny pieces of ham like treasure. Barley stayed dense and chewy, making the meal feel heavier and more satisfying. 44. Creamed potato bread bowl. Simple often meant survival. It started with potatoes boiling until soft, surrounded by a creamy, watered-down milk broth. Stale bread pieces were torn directly into bowls. Then the hot soup was poured over. The bread transformed soup into a complete meal. A thick, creamy bowl looked richer than it was, providing emotional comfort. Some added bacon grease for flavor. Others just used heavy pepper. 45. Rice and onion broth bowl. This dish existed because families needed filling. Dinners using almost no expensive ingredients. Browned onions created deep flavor and rich smells. Then water and rice entered the pot. The rice expanded, turning thin broth into something substantial. Mothers used smell and texture to make cheap rice feel like dinner. Some added an egg if available, but most versions stayed extremely simple. 46. Bean and corn chowder bowl. One of the smartest meals, combining cheap protein with filling vegetables. Potatoes thickened the broth naturally. The beans created heaviness while corn added sweetness. This meal stretched beautifully, changing based on whatever remained in the kitchen. 47. Tomato potato soup bowl. Tomatoes and potatoes became a reliable wartime combination. The result was a survival classic. Canned tomatoes helped cheap meals taste bigger. The smell of simmering tomatoes and onions offered emotional comfort during stressful wartime evenings. 48. Noodle gravy bowl. Flavor could make cheap ingredients feel like enough. Flour and broth created a thin gravy where noodles cooked directly. Brown onions created aromas associated with meat, helping these end-of-the-week meals feel emotionally richer when money was gone. 49. Lentil rice bowl. This created cheap protein and heavy fullness. Lentils simmered with whatever vegetables were available before adding rice. Government campaigns encouraged lentils over meat. Not fancy, but dependable. And during wartime, dependable meant everything.